Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We're back in the book of Job. We're going to be in chapters 28 through 31 today. And if you remember the book of Job, it tells the story of a man who loses everything, his family, his wealth, his health, and yet he refuses to turn his back on God. He refuses to curse God. His friends are insisting that his suffering must be because of some great sin in his life, but Job knows that that's not true, and by the time we reach the end of chapter 27, Job is still standing on his integrity. Now, in chapters 28 through 31, everything kind of slows down a little bit. Job stops arguing and he starts reflecting. And what he gives us here is some deep stuff. It's about wisdom, about suffering, and what it really means to live a life that honors God. So if you've ever asked yourself the question, where is God in my suffering? Or why do bad things happen when I've tried my best to live right? Or maybe even you've asked, what does it actually mean to live wise? What does that mean? This section of scripture speaks directly to that, so stay with me and let's dive in. So, the beginning part of chapter 28, Job starts with this picture of human ability. He talks about people know where to mine silver and how to refine gold. They know where to dig from the earth and how to smelt copper from rock. They know how to shine light in the darkness and explore the farthest regions of the earth as they search in the dark for ore. So he's describing ancient day mining where people would dig deep into the earth, they would search out hidden treasure. And Job's point is this: humans are incredibly good at finding what is hidden. But then Job asks the real question in verse 12. It says, "But do people know where to find wisdom? Where can they find understanding?" He goes on to tell us where it's not found. Verse 13, "No one knows where to find it, for it has not been found among the living. It's not here, says the ocean, nor is it here, says the sea. It cannot be bought with gold, it cannot be purchased with silver. It's worth more than all the gold of Ophir, greater than the precious onyx or lapis lazuli. Wisdom is more valuable than gold and crystal." So you can find gold, but you can't find wisdom that way. You can build wealth, but you can't purchase understanding. And then comes Job's answer in verse 23, where it says, "God alone understands the way to wisdom. He knows where it can be found." And then the anchor of the entire chapter is the last verse of chapter 28, where it says, "The fear of the Lord is true wisdom. To forsake evil is real understanding." That's it. Wisdom is not just knowledge, it is a life aligned with God. It's fearing Him, it's trusting Him, it's turning away from our sin. Jesus even asked the question in Matthew where he says, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but he forfeits his soul?" You can win in life and still lose the thing that matters the most. Then in chapter 29, Job starts to look back. He says in verse 2, "I long for the years gone when God took care of me, when He lit up the way before me and I walked safely through the darkness." Job's remembering a time where God felt close. Then in verse 12, he starts describing the kind of man that he was. He says, "For I assisted the poor in their need and the orphans who required help. I helped those without hope, and they blessed me. And I caused the widows' hearts to sing for joy. Everything I did was honest. Righteousness covered me like a robe, and I wore justice like a turban. I served as eyes for the blind and feet for the lame. I was a father to the poor and assisted strangers who needed help. I broke the jaws of godless oppressors and plucked their victims from their teeth." So that's real righteousness right there. Not just a belief, but an action behind that belief. And that lines up with the book of James later in Scripture that says that pure religion is to visit orphans, to help widows in their affliction. And Job, he lived that out. And he was respected too. We see that in verse 8 of chapter 29, where he says, "The young stepped aside when they saw me, and even the aged rose in respect at my coming. The princes stood in silence and put their hands over their mouths. The highest officials of the city stood quietly, holding their tongues in respect." But here's what matters. Job is not bragging. He's saying, "I lived right, and yet I am still suffering." But then in chapter 30, everything kind of flips around. Job is saying that those same people that once respected me are now the very same people who are mocking me. Verse 1 says, "But now I am mocked by people younger than I, by young men whose fathers are not worthy to run with my sheepdogs." Then we jump on down to verse 16 where it says, "And now my life seeps away, depression haunts my days. At night my bones are filled with pain, which gnaws at me relentlessly. With a strong hand God grabs my shirt. He grips me by the collar of my coat. He has thrown me into the mud. I'm nothing more than dust and ashes." And then we get this raw sort of emotion, this cry to God from Job that says this in verse 20, "I cry to you, O God, but you don't answer. I stand before you, but you don't even look. You have become cruel toward me. You have used your power to persecute me. You throw me into the whirlwind and destroy me in the storm. God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, that is a hard place to be, and if we're honest, some of us have been there in those seasons, crying out, getting nothing in return or feeling like we're getting nothing in return. And it reminds me of those words spoken by Jesus on the cross where he's like, God, why have you forsaken me? And it's important that Jesus used those words because it reminds us that Jesus understands our suffering. So if you feel like you're in a season of suffering or hardship or loss or grief or depression, you're not alone. It's okay to bring those feelings, those emotions to God. Faith is not pretending that everything's fine. Faith is bringing your problems and your pain directly to Him. And then in chapter 31, Job does something bold. He basically says, God, examine my life. He walks through all these heavy topics. Purity. In verse 1, he says, I've made a covenant with my eyes not to look with lust at a young woman. He talks about integrity in verses 5 and 6, where he says, Have I lied to anyone or deceived anyone? Let God weigh me on the scales of justice, for he knows my integrity. He talks about justice. In verse 13, he says, If I have been unfair to my male or female servants when they brought their complaints to me, how could I face God? And then listen to his reason why in verse 15, where he says, For God created both me and my servants. He created us both in the womb. That's powerful stuff because every person has dignity because they're made by God in God's image. And then he says in verse 24, Have I put my trust in money or felt secure because of my gold? Have I gloated about my wealth or all that I own? Job didn't worship money. He didn't worship creation. He didn't rejoice when his enemies fell. And then he ends all of that in verse 35 by saying, If only someone would listen to me. Look, I will sign my name to my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser write out the charges against me. I would face the accusation proudly. I would wear it like a crown, for I would tell him exactly what I have done. I would come before him like a prince. He's saying, God, look at everything. I have nothing to hide, and that is true integrity. Not perfection, but a life that is honest before God. So here's what it all comes down to. First, wisdom comes from God alone. Job tells us back in 28:28 that the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. Second, suffering is not always punishment. The life of Job proves that to us. And third, integrity matters deeply to God. Who we are in private matters to God. See, Job is longing for someone to step in, someone to stand between him and God. And thankfully for you and me, we know who that is. Jesus. Christ became to us wisdom from God. And while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Job wanted justice, and thanks to what Jesus did, we receive mercy. So here's the question for you and for me. Are we chasing success or are we chasing wisdom? Are we trusting in God even in those seasons of life where things don't make sense? And are we living with integrity even when we think nobody else will see? Because at the end of the day, the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. That is wisdom. Won't he do it?